Good evening. November was the month when, no doubt about it, art was eclipsed by politics. No sooner had we devoted a whole programme to interviewing the Minister of the Arts than he got a new job and we got another minister. However, such was the momentum of events that it even tempted Salman Rushdie out of hiding and into the Late Show studio to meditate on the end of Thatcherism. All in all, it was a month of endings. Malcolm Muggeridge, Lawrence Durrell and Roald Dahl all took their leave, while the Royal Shakespeare Company closed its doors at the Barbican for 4 months and the Sunday Correspondent closed its doors forever. But there were other things going on in the arts world, as our 3 November guests are here to testify. They are film director Derek Jarman, painter Maggie Hambling, and writer and journalist Jackie Stephen, until this week the TV critic of the Sunday Correspondent. And their choices? Well, let's start with Derek. For relaxation while slaving over his next screenplay, Derek has been tuning into some music, a brand new CD of The Sinking of the Titanic by the contemporary British composer Gavin Bryars. It's a piece of music originally composed in 1969, but over the years it's been adapted and modified until this version, recorded live at a special performance event held in a water tank in France this April. As the title suggests, the piece was inspired by the awesome sinking of the Titanic in 1912, and in particular, eyewitness reports that as the ship slid inexorably into the icy water, the orchestra were playing a hymn. This new version was performed again yesterday as part of the Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival by the students of Huddersfield Polytechnic. The Late Show went to a dress rehearsal. Derek, what so enthralled you about the music?
Well, I was actually thrilled at that to read that Gavin Bryars, who I've never met, and actually I've never seen the performance, was re-performing The Sinking of the Titanic, because in the mid-70s, Brian Eno, who made the music for the first 2 of my films, sent me this large box of LPs. One of them was The Sinking of the Titanic, and the first thing I remember was the title. I thought, that's extraordinary, The Sinking of the Titanic. And I put Gavin Bryars' music on in my studio on the river, which is very near water, of course, and the boats going up and down the River Thames, and listened to it in the way that painters often do, have music in the background. And it was one of the first sort of, I'm certain it's probably not the correct description, but sort of pieces of ambient music that I'd heard. And it was also a sort of archaeology of sound. It had memory in it. It had, well, voice of, I think, someone who was a survivor of the Titanic. It had sort of sonar depths. It sounded as if the whole thing had been composed under the water. I was fascinated by this because in the 60s, I think Gavin first conceived this work in 1967. He'd been working with John Cage. I think he'd been helping John Cage, and he had also worked with Steve Reich. I had written a fairy tale which was called The Archaeology of Sound, and it was to do with poets who came to a spring called Aquavit, which was the water, and heard the bubbles came up from this spring. It was like a Perrier water spring, and in the bubbles were sounds, memory, thoughts, and poetry. And this piece of music, in a way, was an introduction to, another introduction into a world of music which was just really beginning at that time. And since, I mean, he's gone on to compose perhaps more, it sounds more conventional, I haven't heard it, more conventional music.
Well, let's stick with this. Jackie, there are extraordinary images which one reads in the sleeve notes which actually introduce you to the sound. Do you think you need the images of the hymn being sung and the ship going down to understand the piece?
Well, I think that it works on two levels. The music itself, I think, works just as a beautiful hypnotic piece of music that I think is so moving, and you just have that feeling of life being sucked away and of all those people just going down. But I think that what the sounds do is really they resurrect that feeling of life going on while the ship is still going down. It's not just that life is sinking away, and the fact that the band is carrying on playing and all these other sounds, they indicate that this is like a whole world sinking.
There's a lot of kind of intellectual thought that's gone into it, Maggie. One of the really interesting things in the sleeve notes is the Marconi's original idea that sound never dies. It simply gradually is absorbed, and therefore the sound of the orchestra playing the Titanic is still somewhere there underneath the Atlantic. And there's that quality in the music too.
Well, I particularly didn't read anything before listening to the music. I knew the title was The Sinking of the Titanic, and I just listened to the music. And like Jackie, I found it deeply moving. I thought the precision of every moment of it was spectacular. I mean, when we came to suddenly those sounds which I understood to be drips of water inside the ship, which later I read and discovered to be Morse signals or something, right? But the precision, one's awareness of oneself as one listened to the music, and I mean, I find it terrifically visual music, and so that part of the music for me was the ship itself, and part of the music was the sea. And the force of the sea gradually overcoming this monumental ship. I think the piece of music is pretty monumental and very somber and very exciting.
So you didn't feel at all that you needed to know what it was about. The music did it all for you. It was a visceral and physical experience.
Absolutely.
As well as an intellectual one.
There are these reminiscences from two survivors within it, and you can't really hear what they're saying, the details of it, but it didn't matter. It was the fact that there were these survivors, and I thought that was very interesting to hear people.
But I thought it was terribly important that you couldn't make out the words. I mean, I must say, I immediately thought of Cage and my first experience of Cage when he was here with Merce Cunningham, I think, in the 60s, Derek, and Merce was dancing, and Cage came onto sat at a desk on the stage and talked about going to the dentist while Merce Cunningham was dancing, which is sort of a terrific kind of vision, memory in one's life.
I know we could go on for a long time, but I don't want to squeeze out the other two people's choices, Derek, so I'd like to move on now to Jackie Stevens' choice.